this evening we are going to study Nehemiah 2, verses 9 to 20. You'd have remembered that last week we looked at Nehemiah 2, verses 1 to 8. And in that text, Nehemiah approached the king. The previous week we had talked about Nehemiah asking God to give him favor with the king. And then last week we see that the king is in the hand of the Lord and he can turn it whichever way he wants. Well, at the end of the day, Nehemiah got permission to leave. He also got the protection he needed to go through the various boundaries, and he also got the provision to complete the work that he was going to do. Today we picked up with Nehemiah leaving the palace and going to Jerusalem. In verse 9 it reads, "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen." So right away we see both the permission and the protection. So in this verse we see that the passage is provided by God. God allowed him safe passage from Susa down to Jerusalem. And so as he came at the checkpoints, what Nehemiah did was he produced the king's letter. And these letters from the king gave him clear passage. And then, of course, the verse is telling us that the king's escort was with him. So that's verse 9. In verse 10 we read, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." Now it's a very interesting text. If you notice, it starts with a "but." So it brings a contrast from the easy passage he had to Jerusalem to these persons who were the opponents of Nehemiah and opponents of the Lord, I would say. So what we find in this verse is the opponents of God's word. The first one is Sanballat. Sanballat, the Horonite. Now, a number of persons have tried to reason out where Haran was, because he was a Horonite. Some people believe it was a place that is related to Moab. I don't know if the evidence is there for that, and therefore some would say that Sanballat is a Moabite and Tobiah is an Ammonite, two relatives that gave trouble to the people. Not sure. There's also a place in Palestine that could have been Bet Horan. So we're not too sure where Sanballat is from. But what we know is that both Sanballat and Tobiah, they oppose the work of God. And why did they oppose the help to God's people? In Jamaican language, we say they were a bad mind. Really, they did not want the people to get any kind of help. And the fact that the people are going to be helped made them very bitter. Verse 11 reads, "So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Interestingly, God's servant enters with no fanfare. No fanfare. Didn't announce himself, and he slipped in unnoticed. And for 3 days, he just, in a sense, took a position that was very low." That's very interesting, because here's an high official from Susa, from Persia, who was coming now to help the people in Jerusalem. But he did not announce himself. Some of us have a problem with that. If we feel that we have a big job to do, we want everybody to know the king has given me authority to come, God has moved away, and we want everybody to, in a sense, fall down and worship us. But this is not the way we find Nehemiah. In fact, Nehemiah's entrance into Jerusalem kind of reminds me of Jesus' entrance into the world. No fanfare. Very simple, very humble. He was there for 3 days, made no big deal. Nobody would have known. I want to challenge you that when God gives you a task, you don't have to go about trying to impress people. What you are to do is do the task that God has given you. And here we find Nehemiah, and he comes in very quietly, spent 3 days, and I guess he was resting up. And we would say today the jet lag came off, and there he was. In verse 12 we read, "Then I arose in the night." So after 3 days, he arose in the night, "I and a few men with me. And I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode." So here's Nehemiah. He's in the city, and he's about to do a survey of what's going on. But notice again, there's no fanfare. There's not a lot of people around him. is going about this task in a very simple way. So here we find in this verse, God's servant chooses a discrete time to gather the details. He was going to gather the details for himself about what was going on. And notice a time that would be free from hindrances. Nobody was around. It was at night. Probably most people were in their bed. And so he could easily move around without any problem. And it was a time that would allow a careful examination without any interference. Nobody would know what he had to do. He just went about doing his job, getting ready to do what God had told him to do. You know, sometimes when we need to be quiet and to find out some details in order to do God's work, we cannot do it in a way that people notice that we are doing it. This is not Nehemiah's style at all. Let's read verses 13 to 15. Very interesting set of verses. Here what it reads. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went unto the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. Now, a number of scholars will do a lot of things with those gates, and probably rightly so. My interest is not there, so I want to say to you that what we see here is God's servant makes a detailed analysis. What happened is Nehemiah had gotten a report. He got a report that the walls had broken down. He got a report that the gates were burnt. But if Nehemiah was going to restore these broken walls, if Nehemiah was going to repair the gate, then Nehemiah needed a first-hand information of what the real problem was. And so what we find here is looking at the extent of the damage. So if we follow the ride of Nehemiah at the various places, and those places can be documented from the text, we find that what he did, he made an analysis of where the breaches were, where the holes were in the wall. Then he made an analysis of the material needed, because if you know the breaches, then you know what to do. And he makes an analysis of what was reusable, because some of the broken walls would have had things that could be reusable. I want to suggest to us who are Christian leaders and Christians in general that when God gives us a task, and notice he said God had put it in his heart. When God gives us a task, that one of the first things we do is that we take time to understand the task and understand what needs to be done in order we can have a proper approach. And what Nehemiah did was that he took time when nobody else was around to go from stage to stage. He went around the entire wall, as we noticed. And what he did, he took an analysis. I don't know if he drew a plan, probably he did, at various juncture to see what needed to be done at each juncture. It is very, very important that when we have a task from God, if you are a leader and you get into a new situation, that you take time to understand the real difficulties in that situation. Take time to analyze what's there. Don't just run in with your idea as if you know. You need to learn from who is there. If you take over a new position in church, like you become the Sunday school superintendent or the choir director, whatever position you take, it is very, very important that you look carefully at what is there before you start to fix. Until Nehemiah knows the extent of the damage, he is not ready to do any fixing. Verse 16 reads like this, and the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Nehemiah did not announce himself first. So God's servant must wait on the right time to disclose the plan of God. And he was in a position now to disclose the plan of God, because he needed to know the extent of the work and devise a possible strategy before he disclosed the plan of God. I find sometimes that we are quick and we are hasty, especially if we find that we have authority or we are in a position. But Nehemiah was approaching this in a very, very structured way. Might I say to us that Nehemiah's dependence is on God. He's God's servant. God put the thing in his heart. And what he wanted to do is make a good representation of what God told him to do. And he also wanted to do a very good job. You cannot do a good job of something unless you first analyze it. You can't know what to say to people until you know exactly what the extent of the job is. And so every single one of us who got a move to do something need to take time to study what that task entails. And then once we understand that, we are ready to make a pronouncement to the people. So notice now, verse 17 through to verse 18 reads like this. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burnt. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. Now, God's servant rallies the people. Having looked at what the extent of the work is, he now comes to the people and he raises the situation before them. What the leader wants is buy-in. If you are in a new situation, you're going to work with people, you want persons to support what you are doing. For people to support what you are doing, they need to have a good sense that you know what's going on and you know what you want. So here we find Nehemiah, and there are 5 things that I want to pick out of these verses. The first is this. He said, we have a problem that brings us scorn. Notice what Nehemiah is doing. He is including himself. He said, the problem of Jerusalem is my problem. So we have a problem. Now, if you remember what I said to you a couple of weeks ago, with the gates burnt and the wall broken down, the city was defenseless. The whole problem is that the whole matter of justice and advice had gone through the window. People could walk into the city anytime they want to. They couldn't police that wall that was in such a condition. Wild animals could come in, so they had a problem. People could always kind of look at them in a very difficult way. And so Nehemiah now owns the problem, and he says, we have a problem, and here's the problem. People are talking about the deplorable situation we're in. And then he said to them, you know what, let us move this shame from us. So what he does, he raises the issue, he shows them how it is viewed by the people around, and he says, no, the problem has to be fixed by us. If we want to remove the shame, we have to do something about it. And then the third thing he did was he says, guess what? God's favor is upon us. As he outlined, I'm sure, how God made a way for him by touching the heart of the king, and how God directed that process. He says, we have God on our side. We have God's favor. And then he says, guess what else? The king's support is with us, because the king provided the material. The king has given me clear passage to come. The king gave me an escort. So guess what? We have God and we have the king. You know, so often when there's a problem in the church and there's a problem in our personal lives, rather than look at what we have going for us, we focus on the problem and we see it as insurmountable. Here is a big problem, but Nehemiah's focus was not so much on the difficulty that would lie in the walls, but his idea was to keep his eyes on the God who up to now had shown him favor. And there was no reason why God would not show him favor further on. Sometimes God calls us to a ministry and it seems impossible because every single thing around us says this ministry is going to fail. We need to know that God is with us in that ministry. And you know what else is important? If you are in a church and you have been appointed to a new position, I am sure your pastor is going to back you up. So not only do you have God's favor, but you have the leadership favor. And if you have those two things, then you can move forward. And here Nehemiah is able to rally the people because he's able to say to them, God is with us, God is with us. And not only is God with us, but the king of the entire empire is with us. And so what is the people's response? The people pledge their support. They said, let us arise and build. They were motivated enough to do the work. And sometimes we just need that motivation. That motivation must come from the confidence that God is on our side. That motivation must come from the fact that we know the leaders are behind us. And here the people decided that they would work. Let's read verse 19. But when Sanballat, you remember him, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite, the servant, and Geshem, the Arab, now this is a third person, heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Now, can you imagine this? Now, in some commentators will tell you Sanballat, as I said before, is a Moabite. Tobiah is clearly an Ammonite. And Geshem here is an Arab, which means that he might be an Ishmaelite, which would have been Abraham's son that he had with Hagar. And they are seeing this as three of the nations that are related to Israel, but they are bastard children, as it were, creating problems for Israel. That's interesting, whether you take that or not. But if you remember, when the people of Israel came out of Egypt, there was a mixed multitude. People who seemed to be a part of the group, but they were not really Jews. Sometimes in church, when we have some things going on, we have some persons just like these. They are ready to jeer, they are ready to despise, they are ready to make false accusations. And anything you try, they are negative about it. So the opponents to God's work, they usually jeer what's going on. They despise you because you are doing God's work. They ridicule you because that's what they did. And they also accuse you. Here they said, you are rebelling against the king. How could he be rebelling against the king when the king was the one who gave him safe passage? The king was the one who sent him with protection. The king was the one who made the provision for the work that they were about to do. And we have to watch the negative people when we have a task from God. Because the evil one is not going to let us do the task without trying to disturb us. And part of the difficulty we find when we have the task is whether or not we are going to trust God. Because God is testing our faith to see whether we are going to look at the negative around us or we are going to focus on Him. Can you remember Peter, who said to Jesus, may I come? And when Peter is coming, he took his eyes off Jesus and began to look at the waves. And immediately as he did that, he began to sink. God wants to give you favor. But what we often don't realize is that we allow the enemy to come with distractions that take us away from the task. One of the things you're going to learn from Nehemiah is that we need to keep focused on what we are doing. So here's Nehemiah's response to the opponents to God's work. They jeered, they despised, they ridiculed, they accused. And sometime when you are doing God's work, people are going to come along and they're going to criticize every single thing you are doing. They are going to try to tear you down. You have to know that if God has given you a task, you need to focus on what God has said. The last verse is this, in verse 20. Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we as servants will arise and build. But you, he talking to the opponents, have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. You have to know how to reply as God's servants, the reply of God's servants. Don't allow the people who come along criticism to get you off course. Hear what he said to them. God will prosper us. You have to know, even when the things seem as if it is going to, it can't raise up, that God will prosper you. Nobody else can prosper you but God. You have to keep your focus that God is going to do it. And he says, not only will God prosper us, we will complete the work. The task will be finished. This work will be finished. And you know, when God gives you a task, and it's a task that is going to build His kingdom, the devil is going to try to stop you. You have to remember God is with you. And if you work with God, the task will be completed. And the last thing he says, you have no claims in this matter. You have to tell them, you have to put them in their place sometime and say, you have nothing to do with this. Go your way. I want to assure you that if God puts something in your mind, no matter how big it seems, no matter how far-fetched it seems, if God has given it to you, then God is going to work with you. I trust that you do not allow the naysayers and the persons who come with their criticism and their negativity to deter you from accomplishing what God has placed you on earth to do. Paul is clear. God said that he has marked out a good work for you, for me, for each of us. And if God has marked out a work and God has told you, then guess what? God will accomplish it through you. May God bless you.